today is International Women's Day. I think the women of Palestine we have to remember today. We are experiencing, we are witnessing, I think, one of the most horrific acts of genocide that I have seen in my lifetime. And the women and children of Palestine are going through unspeakable horrors in Gaza, of course, but also in the West Bank. And I would just like to express my solidarity and send as much as possible all of our strong hopes and wishes for their survival and their resilience as well. Okay, so let me just, I think, already you seem to know everything about it because Vetri and Priya have already described the problem in a way to all of you. But let me just begin with a question that I'm often asked by lots of people, by colleagues, by government officials. Why do you want to bring this whole women and men thing into everything? They say you want to bring this difference between men and women, not just in households or in work, but you want to talk about it even with climate change, which is a planetary phenomenon, which is nature. You want to talk about it about international finance. What is this big thing about making a difference between men and women? The impact is on human beings and on nature and on animals. That's what I'm often told. That why should we distinguish between men and women in terms of that impact? And there are two broad ways in which it differs. Okay? One is the purely, if you like, the physical, biological part. The fact that women are, whether they like it or not, responsible for a lot of reproduction. And that affects the entire life cycle. That affects everything in the life, right? In terms of what happens when you're an adolescent, what happens when you are, let's say, pregnant, when you're a mother, when you deliver, when you're lactating, etc. And all of that means that you have different needs over the life cycle. You have different needs in terms of nutrition, in terms of the healthcare, in terms of the protection that you will need over a particular period. And that's a purely physical, biological thing. But then there is another part of it, which is not physical or biological. It's actually socially created. And Priya was talking about that. Okay? It is entirely a socially constructed notion of what women can or should or are able to do. And it is based on something which is very different from what we are used to be thinking about in terms of inequality. So, economists, we typically talk about distributive inequality. Who gets how much of what? Who gets this much money? Who gets this much income? What are the differences in wages? What are the differences in ownership? We look at the distribution. But there is another aspect of inequality. It's called relational inequality. And relational inequality is all about the power some person has over another person, or a group has over another group. And gender inequality is a very big part, an expression of this relational inequality. Okay, so what does it mean? It's really, as again Priya mentioned, it's really all about power. Okay, and the fact that it's not necessarily all men have a power over all women, but society has a power over women that determines the things that they can do over their life. And one of the things that therefore they do is care, is looking after other people. It is a very critical part of what every little girl grows up thinking, that it is your job to be looking after other people. That you will be responsible eventually, you will grow up, you will marry, you will be responsible for looking after your family. Of course, your husband, but your children, the elders in the family, those who are ill, who are sick, who are, all of that, all of the care work is, in a sense, your job, okay? So care work duties are a very critical part of that. And if you recognize that, you can already see how climate change is going to impact differently. But we'll come to that in a minute. There's also the idea that it's typically women who are in charge of making sure that everyone in the household gets something to eat, gets all, the care work is not just about when you're sick or when you're old or when you're a little baby. It's all about the regular parts of life. And typically, again, women are responsible for making sure you have all of those aspects of the regular part of life. So women are responsible for making sure that that family has got the essentials. Okay? Not just in terms of the income, but fetching water. Who fetches water in India today? It's mainly women. Who fetches fuel wood? who does all of the other little things that make sure, the basics come into the house. Okay? Related to that then is what you could call, when women do go out and work, what we call occupational segregation. That is, the things you do tend to be quite limited. Or rather, what society thinks you are better at doing tends to be quite limited. Not the things you can do. Okay? So women get pushed into certain kinds of jobs. They get pushed into care work kinds of jobs. Let's say looking after, in the paid form, not just in the unpaid form. There is, of course, all that unpaid work. But in addition, when you are in paid work, women dominantly are in these other types of paid work, low grade kinds of care activities, or other activities which are seen to be not so skilled. It's extremely interesting, that there is this whole idea that women are the weaker physically and they can't do a whole lot of things. But you look at how technology has changed work. When a job is really difficult, when it is arduous, demanding, I don't know how many of you have tried rice transplanting. I tried it once, I could manage 10 minutes. I really couldn't manage more than that. It's a terribly back-breaking job. Women do it, okay? When we had extremely manual construction activities, when it was very hard and you would see the scaffolding, you had to climb up with weights and deliver sand or deliver bricks up to the tops of, it was women who were doing it. Now construction is extremely automated, right? You have these machines, you have hard hats, you have protective gear. Now who gets to handle the machines? The men. Okay? Similarly, you will find in agriculture, the more mechanized you get, the less physical labor is required. The men get to run the machines. In other words, it has nothing to do with physical strength. Okay? It's really a gendered construction that says, no, women are no good with machines. Okay? The men will get to do the easy job because the men are good with machines. The women, it's decided, are not. Okay? It's entirely a social construction over there. But it does mean that it's an occupational pushing away. You're not really getting into a lot of these jobs. How many women truck drivers have you seen? I can assure you that I have driven with women and men, and women are generally better drivers. Okay, but there's no question that women will be truck drivers. It's just not seen as something that they will do. Because of that occupational segregation and the other things that I talked about, the power imbalance, you find that most women in India, for sure, but everywhere, the working conditions are fragile, often very long hours, very tedious, very repetitive, very strenuous, very low paid. In India, we have one of the largest wage gaps in the world. On average, women get 60% of what men get. And in many occupations, they get half of what men get. Okay? And of course, this is not just true in the market, it's true of private employers, but it's also true of the public employers. Right? You employ women to run your health system. Ashas are running our health system. You employ women to run the entire maternal care and early childhood system, Anganwadi workers. But you don't call them workers because you don't want to pay them the minimum wage. They're volunteers, it seems. We're all, women because we love looking after others, so we volunteer for this work and you get a tiny fraction of the official minimum wage. Okay, so even the government, even public sector does that. You also get, because of the way societies are constructed, women own less assets. It means therefore they get less access to credit. When they are self-employed, let's say they are running a small, they're selling bananas or they're running a small shop selling food, whatever, they don't get credit, they don't get the inputs on the same terms, they don't have the same access to markets for selling their products. They don't get access to government subsidies because they typically won't have a title, they won't have the ownership. Now, all of these things that I have said apply not just to women in general, but specifically, it's very, what is called intersectional. It's very determined. And I think Jayati also mentioned this, right? It's very determined by class, by caste, by ethnic origin, by language, by religion. All of these things determine, in fact, how badly off or how relatively less power you have. And that's particularly, therefore, you can see that it's not just one little ladder, it's a sort of set of interconnecting ladders in which Those who are already disadvantaged because of caste, class, etc., are particularly then worse disadvantaged because of being women. And then there are all these issues about mobility, that you would get permission, let's say from a household head, a man, a father, a brother, a husband, what have you, to even move around, to have the agency to decide what you will do in terms of work and so on. Now, all of these socially constructed things are very important in looking at the impact of climate change. Again, I think Priya already identified some of these issues. And I know in this room there are some excellent reporters, I can say Aparna and Kavita and others, who have talked about this, how it plays out in terms of actually the conditions of specific women. Okay? But now let's look at then climate change. Again, already you know, and you've been told, and it's been very beautifully summarized, but let me just repeat a little bit of it. What does it do? What is it doing already? And let's be clear, it is already doing it. It's not something in the future, it's happening to us right now. Okay? So what's it doing? Of course, there's an increase in temperature. We all know that it's hotter, for sure. But there's a major change in rainfall patterns. Monsoons, they come later, they have more variations. You have a big flood of water instead, and then many weeks of no rain. You have all kinds of different timing of the water, which affects the irrigation, affects your access in cities for sure, but it's certainly in agriculture. But agriculture also has all kinds of other problems. Desertification all through North India. Previously cultivated lands are becoming deserts. Okay? The soil quality is worsening. In some areas, you're getting salination of the soil. It's getting harder and harder to get proper cultivation out. Of course, then you get these shocks, as they're called. You get floods, you get cyclones, you get earthquakes, you get the big disasters. But you know, the big disasters, at least you can identify them and say, oh my God, here is a flood, then we have to give compensation. There is a longer-term tendency that is happening because of the climate change, which is also eroding people's incomes and livelihoods and really forcing them to move, forcing climate refugees, as they are called. Okay? We're getting new pests, and we're getting different pests. We're getting things happening, locusts arriving, grasshoppers arriving because of things going on in North Africa. We're getting new diseases. It's not just COVID. We have newer zoonotic diseases which have come and which are more likely to come. Swine flu, bird flu, etc., because of not just human beings' interaction with animals, but the way the climate is making animals the third stage. All of this we know is happening. And of course, many different changes in the way we can use land. In Chennai, you are right next to the sea. You know what happens when sea walls rise. You know what happens when parts of the city would effectively sink. Okay? But there are parts of the country where rivers are changing course. And people have just lost land because suddenly it's all water. West Bengal, it's very, very evident over there. So lots of changes in terms of climate change. And this obviously has human implications, right? So let's look at the broader human implications before we get into women. Obviously, you can have the worst case scenario, you have to actually move. You cannot stay where you are, you're displaced. So there's forced migration, climate refugees. You have livelihood losses. You can't do the same cultivation, you can't earn as much from it, you can't continue with the same activity. Fishermen are very badly affected. People who have livestock find that they can't do the same thing. You know, women who used to gather forest produce, less and less able to capture many of that, okay? A lot of non-agricultural employment, although livelihoods get dramatically affected by the changes that climate has brought in the infrastructure and whether that city can cope at all. So there is employment loss, there is worse working conditions, you have to work in greater heat or with much more difficult conditions. You have many more unpaid care needs because of the fact that people get sick. People die in different ways. People face a lot of these emotional stresses. So you have the material needs of people. You have the fact that it's harder to get water. It takes longer and longer. You have the physical needs of people because of the actual sicknesses that are coming about. You have the emotional and the mental needs of people. which we don't think about, but also require a lot of care, a lot of time and energy of the caregiver. So all this means much more unpaid work for including household provisioning, for making sure you get the water, you get the fuel to cook with, and all of those things. Then, of course, there's the impact on health. And I don't have to tell you about what that does. We've been through a major pandemic. That's an extreme case. But we know that we can have huge impacts on health because of things that happen with the climate, with extreme heat, for example, with what is called the wet bulb factor, when it's a heat combined with humidity that makes it impossible or creates all kinds of very problematic ability to survive. There's an impact on nutrition if you cannot actually cultivate the kind of food you need or access a variety of food that you need. And of course, there's insecurity. And insecurity of different kinds tends to also breed violence, often an innate violence that is there in society, but typically when you're feeling frustrated, insecure, unhappy, disastrous, and you can't attack the system, it's too big, it's out there, and you can't even attack nature, you attack somebody around you, someone who is weaker than you, who is someone less powerful than you. No guesses what happens therefore. Yeah, much more violence against women. So therefore there is an impact on women in all of their different roles, okay? As individuals over the life cycle, as household provisioners, as unpaid workers, as paid workers, as self-employed people who are trying to eke a living doing, some small business, some minor enterprise, selling, coconuts on the road, whatever. And all of these are affected, as I said, by class, by caste, by religion, by ethnic origin, and so on. The problem is that public policy pays lip service to this. You will always say, any of these climate policies now, they know they have to stick women in there. So let's stick women in there. They put it there. Maybe they'll have a little section saying, women and so on. But it isn't actually part of the policy. It hasn't imbued the policy. They haven't thought about it. And why haven't they thought about it? Because it's all in the silos. They will say, this is our policy, and here is a little section on women. Okay? They're not looking at the interconnections. They're not looking at the feedback loops of one policy and how it impacts women, given these very different conditions that I mentioned. Because these conditions are partly physical, biological, but much more socially determined. But then the people who are doing the policies are also socially determined in the same way. So they're taking all of that for granted. I won't say it's gender blind. I would say it is gender exploitative, because public policy actively uses the knowledge that women will do the unpaid work. So here is the interesting thing about care work, that you can't withdraw it. You can say that it's very strenuous, it's demanding, it's arduous, but you will never say, I will not look after my baby. I will not look after my elderly mother. I will not look after this sick person in my family. You're not going to do that. You will actually look after them. And policy knows that. Public policy takes advantage of that, saying we don't have to bother with a whole bunch of things because it will be taken care of by unpaid labor. And that has been a very critical aspect even in climate policy. Okay? So, of course, we have patriarchal social norms, but we also have patriarchal attitudes in the people who are implementing these policies. Okay? So, it's not just the fact that when there is a disaster, there's very little compensation that women get. It's mostly men who will get it because they have the titles, they have the, they are the ones who are defined as losing something, or, so they are the ones who will get the compensation. Low recognition of the fact that they are workers even. I mean, an unpaid worker is not seen as a worker. Yeah, you look at the survey data, they'll say, oh, she's not in the labor force. Whereas actually they're working from morning to night. Yeah? But they're not recognized, and so public policy doesn't bother about whether they've got working hours. Priya mentioned that it was a big, hard-won fight to get 8 hours a day work. But that doesn't apply to informal workers. It doesn't apply at all to women. The unpaid work can go on for 10, 12 hours. If there is an extreme adversity in terms of the access, you will get much longer working hours, and nobody's noticing it because it's not even called work. It's not recognized that they are workers in any meaningful way. And of course, then the physical insecurity I have mentioned. But it's also that, government policies about climate change, we still haven't absorbed the fact that it's there, and now you have to be planned and proactive about it. It's always reactive. Oh, there's a flood. Now let's quickly do something to patch up for the flood. Oh, there's a cyclone. Let's give some cyclone relief. It's not recognizing that these are things that are going to keep happening. So let us think of a way of dealing with this that brings in all of the different departments or the ministries to work out a strategy to reduce the costs, the human costs, and the costs specifically on women. And then finally, there is this whole thing about what the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have a report. In 2022, they called it maladaptation. So, when things get hotter, what are people in the rich countries doing? They say, oh, let's get more air conditioning. When there are more and more, there's more sinking or there's a rising of the sea levels, then the idea is, okay, put up seawalls and, create these man-made barriers for the water so that it cannot come in, which actually adds to the problem. It doesn't really move away from the problem. It shifts it or it makes it worse. And we're getting a lot of these examples of maladaptation even in India. So what can we do? Well, I would argue that, first of all, we have to stop being obsessed with mitigation. Because, already India, yes, the rich in India definitely emit a lot of carbon. In fact, the rich in India emit double the carbon of the bottom half of the population of North America. Imagine. Actually, we don't need to imagine it. We've already seen what they can spend when they can spend, right? We have recent examples of how much they can do with their money, whether it's private jets or, all kinds of other things that are happening around weddings and other events. But the rest of the country, 80% of the population, we have some of the lowest carbon emissions in the world. And forcing them to have even less carbon emissions is not going to help. It's not going to help anybody anywhere. But what we must do is make sure that at least we can survive. We can be resilient, we can adapt to what we know is changing in nature, and we can see these costs that we've been talking about, especially the costs that are borne disproportionately by women. So what we have to do, we have to recognize all these roles, the life cycle needs, the physical security, the access to credit and markets, the infrastructure that we need, the amenities, the public provision, and all of the kinds of things that would reduce the unpaid work. Because this unpaid work is not, it's not given, it's not a structural thing. It is something that is happening because public policy is not providing those things. So that's where the focus should be. And we should definitely say that assistance, compensation, and all of this does not require a title, doesn't require an ownership deed, doesn't require this person to be recognized as a worker. But most of all, I would say, what does public policy have to do? It has to begin by listening to women. I don't think that happens enough. I don't think it happens at all. And it certainly doesn't happen in terms of listening to the women who are actually affected in particular ways. There are some wonderful stories that Aparna and Kavita and others have done on women in specific occupations, tasks, whether it is salt or it is, all kinds of things. Look at those conditions. Ask them what they need. Women fisher folk, women, what is it that is impacting? What can you do to help? Ask, let's listen to the women. And let's also recognize the role that women are already playing in mitigation. Okay? The collection and preservation of nature, the cultivation of natural farming techniques, okay? Urban waste collection, all kinds of things that are already happening. And the mitigation part is being handled by women. Let's recognize that role and make that role also more feasible, attractive, bearable. Okay? Let's recognize the most important role of women in adaptation in terms of the increased care work that they're doing, which is not recognized, it's not counted, it's not measured, and it's certainly, there's no attempt made to reduce it. So ultimately, I would say there are these 5 R's that we have to do, okay? We have to recognize the work that is being done, the kinds of impacts that are being done. We have to reduce the adverse impacts and reduce the excessive unpaid work and all of that. We have to redistribute a lot of that. between society, this government, let's say cooperatives, and also within families. It's a big ask, I know, to redistribute a lot of this unpaid work within families, but it can be done, okay? We have to reward the people who are doing this. Not just only financial reward, but also financial. Why should women be getting 60% of male wages? Why should unpaid workers not receive any reward of any kind? And, except for the emotional satisfaction of knowing that you're looking after other people. And finally, we have to represent their interests. And how does that happen? How do we get to represent the interests of all these women whom I've talked about? Ultimately, it's the power of association. Which is why, when I looked at that exhibition, it's a very depressing exhibition, very powerful, by the way. You must put labels because, it's a real story. That exhibition tells a wonderful story. But that final photograph is the one that makes you come out saying, okay, yeah, because it is about women mobilizing. It's about a protest in which there are all these hundreds of women sitting. And that's so important because women need to get together and mobilize. And yes, recognize the intersectionality, recognize the specific problems of Dalit women or other women or minorities, etc. But we have to get together. And in that getting together, we have to build coalitions, often with people we don't agree with very much. Yeah, we know that now in politics, we have to hold our nose and vote for certainly in North India, we have to hold our nose and vote for certain people, right? Because we don't want to vote for other people. But in general, we have to get together, organize, and we have to be willing to build coalitions with different groups because that's the only way we can change what is really otherwise quite an oppressive reality. Okay, thank you very much.